Hey guys, so I'm kind of coming at you with a little bit of a different video today because this season, this month, kind of like the colder season going from autumn into winter, just has me wanting to read all the classics. And so I want to read more of them, but I wanted to start by kind of sharing some of my favorite classics, some great classics for beginners, because I've read a few, but I haven't really liked a ton. And I've definitely come across some where I'm like, whoa, I am not smart enough for these. So I thought I wanted to just kind of like give a few tips as far as dipping your toe into classics, some good ones to start with. And yeah, so I tried to get 10 books and I ended up with 11. So 10 plus 1. So I'm basing this recommendation list off of books that are over 100 years old. I wanted to define classics for myself here. So I believe that all of these books that I'm going to be recommending are over 100 years old. There is a fly buzzing around here and it's going to drive me nuts. As someone who feels like they're kind of just getting into classics, I feel like maybe I'm not the person to be doing this recommendation video, but so many of the recommendation videos for classics that I've seen are put out by people that are like English majors and feel a little bit smarter than me, or a lot smarter than me. So I wanted to make a recommendations video for classics for like the average person. So that's what we're doing here. My first tip is going to be try to start with some of the author's shorter works. So I have two books here that kind of fall under that category. And let's start with this one to begin with, because A Christmas Carol. Many of you may know that Dickens writes really long books. Do I have one of his on my shelf? I don't have one there right now, but he's got some massive ones. And I incorrectly said in a video previously that he was paid per word. Apparently that is a myth. What I did know is that his writing, as with many Victorian authors, came out in installments. It was like a periodical, and a lot of them were like, I think 20 installments. So I guess that's why they're kind of longer. But if you start with something like A Christmas Carol, which this particular edition is less than 120 pages, this is not quite so daunting when you compare it to like David Copperfield or Great Expectations or A Tale of Two Cities or yeah, those other ones. So I would highly recommend starting with A Christmas Carol when it comes to Dickens, and yeah, just like starting with some of his shorter works. Even if you've read this and you want something a little bit more, Oliver Twist reads a lot easier and quicker than some of his other books as well. So that's the first one that I have in this category. If you haven't read A Christmas Carol or watched the movie or just have been like living under a rock, our main character is Ebenezer Scrooge, who is a businessman and has very low morals. His old partner, Jacob Marley, is dead, and he's kind of glad about it because then he gets more money. And Jacob Marley kind of like haunts him as a ghost, and throughout the book we have 3 ghosts that come in the course of an evening to kind of help Ebenezer Scrooge change his character. We've got the ghost of Christmas Present, ghost of Christmas Past, and the ghost, I can't talk today, of Christmas Future. And yeah, so I grew up watching like the Mickey Christmas Carol version, and I felt like that really helped me with this as well. Like I feel like the Mickey story actually does a really good job following the storyline. So there's that one. And then Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. I would recommend this for getting into like any Robert Louis Stevenson or anything like that. This is a super short book as well, under 150 pages. Actually, this one has a pretty long essay at the beginning. So yeah, it's under 100 pages, I think, of actual story. This one is about, I guess, man's character and the good and the evil, and is another well-known classic. And I think you go into this one knowing enough. I think the general population knows enough that it makes it easy to read. And once again, it's a short little one, so you can feel like you've accomplished something with classics without having to read a huge novel. I think these are a great place to start. And then like another little tip is maybe watch the movie beforehand. Normally I don't like to do this in books because I don't like spoilers, but with a lot of classics you know a lot of what's going on anyway. But if you watch the movie, then you have like even more of an up, and it can help make the book make a lot more sense. Okay, then my next set of recommendations are kind of piggybacking off of my last tip to read an author's shorter works, and that is to read short stories. Because when you read a short story, you can, if you like it, you can continue with like the short stories from that author, or you can just read one and feel like you've accomplished something. So I have 3 different authors slash short stories to kind of talk about here. The first one I want to share is Father Brown, The Essential Tales. So this is kind of like a Sherlock-esque book, except our detective of sorts is Father Brown. Somehow he just kind of like stumbles across these mysteries. He just happens to be in the place where they occur, and he can solve them because apparently, as like a clergyman, or he's a Roman Catholic priest, apparently he hears a lot during confessional, and that helps him to solve different mysteries. So this was written by G.K. Chesterton. The first short story, I believe, was written in 1910. And yeah, so they do read like a classic, especially the first one that I read, The Blue Cross. It takes a while to get into. You have to trust his writing, and but yeah, like they're short, and so it doesn't take long before you feel like you've, you know, read a classic story. And the next one I want to share here is one where I have only read one of the short stories so far, and the short story itself is The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. The Yellow Wallpaper is about well, it's based on her true experience of having depression and being put into this room with yellow wallpaper. This was, I think this originally was published in a newspaper or something, and helped revolutionize how they dealt with people with depression. She wanted to write, but they thought that would be too distracting, so they didn't let her have anything. It was just like her in this room with wallpaper, and she goes like more crazy because of it. And this was like revolutionary in changing how the medical field dealt with depression. So that was a good one, and I am excited to read more of her short stories. I don't know what vein the rest of them go on, but that's one where you feel accomplished as well, because The Yellow Wallpaper has also been like published just as a standalone, so it's like its own book. Okay, and then I would be completely remiss if I didn't recommend like my absolute favorite book of all time. That's Sherlock Holmes. So Sherlock is written by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, and this particular bind-up has quite a few. It has some of like, I don't think they're considered shorter stories. Some of like the longer shorter stories, A Study in Scarlet, The Sign of the Four, The Valley of Fear. I do not recommend those. I recommend going for the actual short stories. So those are usually bound up into The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, The Memoirs of Sherlock Holmes, The Return of Sherlock Holmes. Oh yeah, and like The Hound of Baskervilles, I didn't really enjoy that as much either. My favorite are like the short stories that are often, like in this thing, they're like 5-ish pages. So they're pretty big pages, maybe 10 pages on a normal story. And Sherlock leaves the clues for you, not Sherlock, but Sir Arthur Conan Doyle leaves the clues, and you can generally figure out the mystery if you're smarter than me. And this is one where I feel like it doesn't feel like it was written as long ago as it was written, maybe because there's so many different like Sherlock spin-offs and stuff these days, or because we kind of just generally have an idea of the whole Sherlock idea, but this doesn't feel like it was written as long ago as it was, but at the same time it helps you gain some of that vocabulary that helps in other classic reading. Okay, next up, this isn't really a tip, but these are kind of just 2 really feel-good classics that don't feel like classics, kind of coming off of that Sherlock. The first one is The Story Girl by L.M. Montgomery. I actually struggled with which L.M. Montgomery book I should recommend here, but this is one of the first ones that I picked up that it was actually published 100 years ago. Some of them are like not quite yet. So The Story Girl is actually kind of also written as a bunch of different short stories. We follow Sarah Stanley, and she has to go live with her cousins on PEI, and it is just the adventures. Like, I have tapped this thing so many times. There's things that made me laugh, things that made me cry. I love L.M. Montgomery's work. So this is just her adventures on this island with her cousins, and the stories that she makes up. She has such an imagination. This was a super easy read. As far as classics go, this is definitely one of the easiest, and It just has you feeling all the feels, and I love that. And definitely, like, along those same lines, but definitely more of a commitment, would be Little Women by Louisa May Alcott. This one is a fairly heavy book. Like, there's a lot going on. This book, I always forget that it is set in somewhere in the US, because it reads like an English novel to me. So we follow 4 sisters, and really it spans multiple years of their lives, which is not usually something I like in classics. But they are going through life. Their father is, what, in the Civil War or something? Because my brain always thinks we're in England, so I always think that he's off like fighting in like one of the world wars. But this is just, I don't know, it's there's so many emotions with this one as well. Like, I feel like it makes you have feel good feels, but then there are like devastating moments in here. Yeah. And our main character, Jo, she is feisty. Reminds me a lot of myself when I was younger, and it is one of those books that just doesn't feel like it was written as long ago as it was. I actually didn't look at the publication date on this one, and it bothers me when they don't say the original publishing date. Well, I'm pretty sure this was over 100 years ago. Yeah, it was published in 1868, so I'm good there. Okay, my next tip is to read some classic poetry. So my absolute favorite is the poetry of Emily Dickinson, another book that I have like all tabbed up. I find her poetry so easy to read. She writes with like, let's find one that I actually tabbed. She writes with like nice short little lines, and her poems are rather short. They don't go on for pages and pages like some poetry does. And I just find this so easy to read. You can read like a couple poems a day, and in a month or two you can have this entire book finished. So definitely try some classic poetry. Thankfully libraries have lots of these in their system, so you can just request a bunch and then read a few poems from each poet and see kind of what resonates with you. Another tip I have when it comes to classic literature is to read children's literature. So one of my absolute favorites is A Little Princess by Frances Hodgson Burnett. I debated whether or not to include this one or to include A Secret Garden. It's kind of a toss-up. I really like both of them. So in this one we follow a girl named Sarah Crewe. I'm losing my voice. And her father has gone off and left her at boarding school, and she is this rich kid but treats everyone so well, and then later finds out she's penniless, and still when she's mistreated she still treats people really well. And this one has definitely some of the older language. It does feel like a classic, but because it was originally written for children, it is easier to read, so definitely a good place to start. Okay, I have 2 more books left, and these I would say are the hardest books to read that I'm including here today. One of my tips that I'm going to share is to read a classic with other people. So the first book I'm going to share I actually read in grade 11 as part of my class, and it wasn't like one of those, it wasn't an English class. That's the funny thing. It was a psychology class. It wasn't like this piece of literature that I had to read for English, so it felt way different to me. But for a couple of years I had a classics book club as well, and that was really good to like read the books, and then I had to make sure I actually understood what was going on. So I would suggest reading a classic with a friend. Okay, so my first book here is The Pilgrim's Progress. So this maybe isn't the easiest book of books to read. We follow Christian on his journey to the Celestial City, I think it was called. I haven't read it since grade 11. I've read The Little Pilgrim's Progress to my kids, but I haven't read this, the original, for 15 plus years, almost 20 years. And so the language in here though is very literal. So in some ways that is really good. Definitely feel free to look up what things mean, look up chapter summaries for classics. That helps. Read a really good synopsis beforehand. That took me a long time to learn with classics because I generally like the mystery suspense genre where you don't want to know the ending, but with classics, so often you need to really understand what's going on. Okay, and then my last recommendation, I just read this month and I liked it and I'm kind of surprised by it, and this is what has spurred me on to read more classics now. And that is North and South by Elizabeth Gaskell. So this is kind of my bonus book because I don't know if this should really be on a recommendation list for beginners, but I found this book so easy to read. So we follow Margaret, who grew up in the south of England and has to move to the north to this like factory town, sturdy factory town, and she goes through a lot of stuff and it follows her over the course of a few years, which I don't normally like, but it was so easy to read and I was curious to see where things were going to go. Elizabeth Gaskell wasn't afraid just to kill off people left and right, which kind of kept me on my toes a little bit. It made it feel a little bit more modern than, I think this was published in 1855, if I'm correct. Yeah, and I had a lot of fun with this and I feel like it read so easily, it needs to be on this recommendation list. So there you have it. There are 11 classics that I would recommend for beginners. I feel like they're all very accessible, and even if you haven't read a lot of classics, I think you should be able to read all of these, maybe with the help of some movies or talking to some people or reading a synopsis. But these are all, in my opinion, pretty easy reads for classics. Now in the future, I plan on reading more classics, and I definitely haven't read all of them, which is why like I'm kind of a beginner myself making this video. So if you have more recommendations for beginners, leave those below. And if you have more classic recommendations for me as well, definitely leave them in the comments because I just want to read all the classics these days. So thanks for watching, guys.